April 8, 1943, 27,000 feet above occupied France. Oberleutnant Ralph Hermican smiled from behind the oxygen mask as he saw the figures ascending with difficulty toward his formation. The Americans sent flying milk bottles, he joked on the radio. Below him, the first P-47 Thunderbolts rose slowly, fighting against their own weight. Coarse, broad, almost comical, to the trained eyes of the Luftwaffe, this was not a fighter. It was an engineering mistake. The Focke-Wulf 190 could turn around it with half the effort. But what Hermican didn't know, what no German pilot in that sky knew, was that they were witnessing the birth of the weapon that would systematically destroy the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. That laughter was about to be silenced by America's industrial avalanche. This video tells how a mocking machine became the greatest aerial annihilation instrument ever created. How a combat doctrine based on maneuvers was crushed by an unthinkable concept. Domination by mass, by durability, by concentrated fire. The P-47 Thunderbolt did not win because it was agile. He won because he didn't need to be. What started as a joke ended as a sentence. The thunder was just beginning. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story, and it's not in the aviation manuals, but in the Wehrmacht's loss reports. Between 1943 and 1945, a single American fighter model, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, was responsible for the destruction of more than 7,000 enemy aircraft, 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 railroad cars, and 6,000 armored vehicles. Numbers that are not only explained by the talent of the pilots, but by something much greater, something that no German doctrine foresaw, the ability of a nation to industrialize air superiority. And it all started with a laugh. If you value stories like this based on facts, analysis, and real historical sources, please leave the like and subscribe. This helps the channel to continue revealing the forgotten truths behind the sound of thunder. The first appearance of the P-47 Thunderbolt in the skies of occupied Europe provoked exactly the reaction its creators feared, and that its enemies wanted. The aircraft seemed, to the trained eyes of the Luftwaffe, a grotesque error of proportion and purpose. In April 1943, Oberleutnant Josef Pips Priller, commander of Jagdgeschwader 26, spotted the new American fighters over France and could not contain his sarcasm. In his report to headquarters, he described them as flying trucks, slow targets, and pregnant cows trying to climb a hill. The bulky frame, rounded fuselage, 3.7-meter propeller, short wings, and lazy climb made up a figure that deviated from everything the Luftwaffe manual taught about combat aircraft. They laughed. And they didn't just laugh, they scoffed confidently. The P-47, weighing more than 7 tons in combat configuration and robust looks, was completely at odds with the standards of German tactical aviation. For a pilot trained in the school of aggressive maneuvers and ascents of the Bf-109 and Fw-190, the Thunderbolt seemed like an anomaly. The Spitfire was sleek, the Messerschmitt was nimble, the Focke-Wulf was lethal, but the Thunderbolt, it was big. And in the German driver's mind, big meant slow, slow meant vulnerable, vulnerable meant easy to shoot down. The appearance of the P-47 was so anticlimactic that it inspired pejorative nicknames among Germans. Der fliegende Möbelwagen, the flying furniture truck. What Luftwaffe officers did not understand at the time was that they were looking at a new form of air warfare, a philosophy that exchanged the elegance of dogfighting for high-altitude dominance, a platform built to absorb, fire, and return, and above all a weapon created not for a battle, but for a war of attrition. A war that Germany could no longer sustain. This difference in perception reflected a deeper chasm, the contrast between two industrial systems. While Germany operated under shortages of aluminum, rubber, and fuel, and relied on decentralized factories under constant attack, the United States expanded its production capacity by the month. By 1943, the U.S. had manufactured more than 85,000 military aircraft. The Luftwaffe, in the same period, produced just over 25,000. Republic Aviation delivered P-47s on an increasing scale. The Farmingdale, Long Island plant produced a new Thunderbolt every 58 minutes. Meanwhile, Germany lost experienced drivers faster than it could produce replacements. And yet, his officers kept laughing. One of the most brutal ironies of this underestimation is that the Germans themselves recorded in internal reports their first visual impressions of the Thunderbolts. Poorly proportioned machines, Wings too short for their weight. Compromised maneuverability. They were partially right. Thunderbolt didn't turn any better. I didn't climb faster, but it wasn't designed for that. The P-47's mission was to fly high, fast, and as it dived, unload a barrage of fire that no Luftwaffe aircraft could absorb. The blind spot was technical, but also psychological. German air doctrine was built around the individual skill of the pilot. Maneuver was honor. The aerial duel was a ritual of precision and cunning. The mere idea of a fighter that survived by being invulnerable to the first burst, and that gained by being able to fire more for longer, seemed ordinary. The P-47 looked wrong because it didn't play the same game, and that's exactly why he won. In May 1943, a secret Luftwaffe report classified the Thunderbolt as inferior in maneuvered combat, but surprisingly resistant to damage. The observation was considered a point of curiosity, not a real threat. At that time, most generals still believed that raw performance in maneuver would prevail. They ignored what the math already announced. The P-47 carried 8 Browning, 50 machine guns with a total of 300-400 rounds, nearly half a ton of ammunition, and could sustain sustained fire for more than 30 seconds. No German fighter came close to this. In 1943, the American industry produced the equivalent of 50 million 50 caliber ammunition per month. Repeat, 50 million. Munitions that fed not only the P-47s but bombers, ships, tanks, and troops. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe had limited stocks of 20mm and 30mm cartridges, with restrictions on use and frequent power failures. This difference, invisible to the naked eye, would explain why so many P-47s returned home with leaky wings, punctured tanks, but engines still running. The robustness was not aesthetic. It was functional. It was industrial. It was American. If this statistic surprised you, 50 million 50 caliber ammunition produced per month, write in the comments, logistics wins. This way we measure who is really paying attention to the details that the story tried to hide. Throughout 1943, German accounts began to change tone. One after another, the veteran pilots began to register an uncomfortable realization. The Thunderbolt did not fall, at least not easily. A pilot of JG-2 reported after an unsuccessful encounter, "We fired it with everything. It didn't fall. He rose like a blind bull and disappeared." Still, the arrogance persisted. The doctrine was maintained. The technical pride still said that it was a matter of tactics, of driving, of skill. But the skies of France already told another story. A story that the Germans could not yet read, but that was already being written with each gust, with each dive, with each lightning bolt that crossed the channel and returned with torn wings, but still lethal. And soon the whole world would see what happened when one enemy relied too much on his own talent and too little on the other's ability to manufacture victory, because the transformation was just beginning, and the day when Thunderbolt would stop being a joke. It was very close. In the skies of World War II, not all battles were fought with ammunition. Some began long before takeoff, in engineering notebooks, industrial warehouses, and military doctrine drawing boards. The clash between the P-47 Thunderbolt and Luftwaffe fighters was more than an encounter between aircraft. It was the clash between two philosophies of air warfare, one based on the art of maneuver, the other on the logic of the mass. For Germany, heir to the Prussian tradition of tactical excellence and the primacy of the pilot as a knight of the air, the ideal fighter was an extension of body and skill, agile, light, aggressive. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 symbolized this doctrine, small, fast, and lethal in sharp turns. The Focke-Wulf 190 took this concept even further, with increased firepower and low-altitude performance. Both reflected a vision where the individual, well-trained, decided the combat in seconds of skill and instinct. It was the duel, the dogfight, the dominance of talent over volume. On the other side of the Atlantic, the United States viewed the war through a different lens. The immense geography, colossal manufacturing capacity, and a continental logistical machine required aircraft with range, endurance, and the ability to absorb damage, not just turn fast. The American driver's mission was not to win in the Giro. It was flying higher, shooting harder, coming home and repeating. The P-47 was born out of that mindset. At 4 tons more than the Bf 109, it was not designed for aerial dancing, but for precision bombing with machine guns, survival in escort missions, and sustained domination of the skies. Its armored structure was a barrier against projectiles. Its radial engine, resistant to damage and without a vulnerable cooling system, was perfect for absorbing impacts and keeping operating even under direct fire. And above all, his mission was clear: to destroy and survive. This difference was not just technical, it was strategic. The Luftwaffe, since the Blitzkrieg, had been oriented to support the ground advance with short-lived tactical interceptions. Its aircraft operated in limited missions, close to the front line, and depended on local dominance for effectiveness. The Allies, especially the Americans, were building a model of independent air warfare with the ability to project power over the enemy rear. The P-47, with supplementary tanks and a supercharged engine, could fly at 30,000 feet, dive at very high speed, destroy the target, and climb again. And even if damaged, it returned. This was not a design accident. It was a product of the American concept of long war, war of attrition, war of resources. While Germany coached aces, the United States coached teams. While the Luftwaffe relied on pilots with hundreds of hours of flight time to maintain superiority, the U.S. made planes faster than its enemies could train replacements. Each P-47 was less dependent on individual genius. It was a reliable, powerful, predictable platform. A reasonable pilot could be effective. An experienced, devastating pilot. It was the end of the duel and the beginning of the aerial juggernaut. What the German generals saw as weakness, lack of refinement, lack of elegance, was in practice the key to a sustainable victory. And the proof of this was in the numbers. While the Luftwaffe lost its irretrievable veterans, the Americans trained 30,000 new pilots a year. In practice, German doctrine bet on a game of marked cards: skill against volume, maneuver against power, instinct against artillery. The P-47 that was climbing heavily towards the German formations did not come to dance. He came to resist, shoot, and survive. And what the Luftwaffe hadn't yet realized was that in a war where every experienced pilot killed was an irreparable loss, the Thunderbolt was an existential threat because it removed the advantage from talent. It didn't matter if the German driver was an ace with 100 wins. It was enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, at the point of 8 synchronized 50 machine guns, and all the glory disappeared in seconds of continuous fire. Modern warfare had changed scale, and the P-47 was his brutal courier, a flying monster that didn't fit the rules of the previous generation. But it worked perfectly in the new game, the game where winning meant keeping production lines running, where logistical efficiency trumped tactical refinement, and where the math of spare parts was as decisive as the caliber of weapons. The Germans still flew to protect the flank, dominate the turn, win in the dogfight. The Americans flew to crush railroads, escort bombers, neutralize fighters, and return at the end of the day to take off again. In an intercepted January 1944 report, a Luftwaffe officer summed up the growing frustration. They are no better pilots, but their planes don't crash and ours do. It was the beginning of doctrinal demoralization, because when a military philosophy begins to be belied by facts, when the machine you despised begins to kill your best men, arrogance turns to silence, and silence, fear. But what would happen when this American machine, initially slow and heavy, began to evolve? When did your engine start to scale like a rocket? When did his war load double? When your mission ceased to be just survival and became total destruction? That answer would come very soon, and it would come from the hands of an engineer who, in 1940, predicted that the war would not be won lightly, but with weight. His name, Alexander Kartveli, and what he designed. No one was ready to face it. In 1940, as Europe sank into chaos, the U.S. Army called for a new race, not on the battlefields, but on the drawing boards. The war in the air was about to change, and something was needed that would master it in altitude, power, and range. Republic Aviation, a still-growing manufacturer, was tasked with answering the call. And at the center of that challenge was an immigrant engineer from Soviet Georgia, with a heavy accent and even heavier convictions, Alexander Kartveli. He did not seek to create only one fighter. It sought to answer the question that no one was asking. What will it take when the sky becomes a steel slaughterhouse? His answer did not please purists. Where other designers spoke of lightness, agility, and elegance, Kartveli proposed weight, strength, and redundancy. Instead of smooth lines, a thick fuselage. Instead of compact engines, the largest radial the United States could produce. The result was the XP-47B, a prototype so large that most engineers doubted it could take off. But it took off, and more than that, it promised to turn each mission into a demonstration of technological brutality. At the heart of the machine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder 2,000 horsepower radial engine with a dual ignition system and two-stage supercharger. It was the same engine that would power the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair, but in the Thunderbolt, it was coupled to a compression system that allowed full performance at 30,000 feet, where the air is thin and most engines lose effectiveness. The XP-47B is not designed to turn in tight turns. He was made to dive from above, breathe fire, and disappear like a hammer thrown from the sky. And for that, it needed to be built as a flying tank. The fuselage was designed with reinforced thickness, capable of absorbing 20 mm projectiles and continuing to fly. The cockpit was encased in armor plates. The oil cooler was repositioned underneath the fuselage, protecting it from direct fire. The retractable landing gear was designed with unprecedented articulation engineering to withstand violent landings in improvised fields. Nothing about the P-47 structure was accidental. It was a fighter designed not for the first combat, but for the 20th. Not to shine in maneuvers, but to return home when everything around him was destroyed. And above all, to repeat it day after day. But perhaps Kartvel's biggest bet was on weaponry. While German fighters used 2 or 4 cannons or machine guns, the P-47 was born with 8 50-caliber Browning M2s, 4 in each wing. Each fired about 800 rounds per minute. The impact was devastating. An attack of a few seconds created a corridor of destruction that broke fuselages, melted engines, and pulverized formations. It was not necessary to aim with surgical precision. It was necessary to point in the direction and keep your finger on the trigger. American doctrine embraced this concept with enthusiasm. The quantity compensated for the accuracy. The volume of fire replaced elegance. It was miniature artillery, condensed into an aerial platform. The development of the XP-47B faced resistance. In initial tests, the aircraft had compression problems in dives and excess weight in short landings. But Republic aviation engineers, with the direct support of the Army, perfected the design with industrial speed. In less than 18 months, the prototype had evolved into a complete production line. Confidence in the project was such that, even before the final tests were completed, 773 units were ordered. The bet was made, and it would be paid for with blood, steel, and air superiority. The logic behind the monster was simple, if brutal. If you're going to face dozens of fighters, survive anti-aircraft fire, break through clouds of flak, and still accomplish the mission, you need something that doesn't just fly. You need something that can resist. And Kartveli knew it. When asked why the plane was so big, he replied coolly, because all he has to do is turn back. This philosophy clashed with everything that German doctrine valued. For the Germans, the ideal was light, fast, and accurate. For Kartveli, the ideal was heavy, durable, and lethal. And when the war began to require long-distance missions, bomber escorts, and deep attacks on infrastructure, it was the dinosaur that proved to be the most adapted animal. In the P-47D combat version, the Thunderbolt was already the largest single-engine fighter aircraft of World War II. Weighing over 7 tons on takeoff, it could carry the equivalent of an entire Spitfire in bombs and supplemental fuel. Its wings held 2 auxiliary tanks, increasing the operational range to more than 1,600 kilometers. This allowed the P-47 to operate beyond enemy lines, escort bombers over the heart of the Reich, and still return with fuel to spare. The enemy did not understand this at first. They laughed at the size. They laughed at the slow climb. They laughed at the silhouette. But they stopped laughing when they realized that he kept coming back, and that every time he returned, he took with him something from the Axis forces: a destroyed train, a decimated train, an enemy wing reduced to wreckage. Thunderbolt wasn't pretty. It was not agile, it was not refined, but it fulfilled a function that German fighters, as elegant as they were, could not replicate. Deliver firepower with industrial precision, come back in one piece, and repeat. And this repetition in the end was what crushed the Luftwaffe, because it wasn't just about winning the fight. It was a question of being able to continue fighting when the enemy could no longer do so. But what happens when a machine made to resist finds, for the first time, its own limit. When a mission seems lost and the enemy already tastes victory, it is at this moment that Kartvel's logic will be put to the test, and the whole world will see what it really means to survive the impossible. The pilot's name was Robert Johnson, and the mission he faced would go down in history. Before reaching the skies of Europe, the P-47 Thunderbolt fought a private war on American soil, and not against the Germans, but against their own pilots. In 1942, the first batches of the new fighter began to be distributed to training units of the United States Army Air Force. Enthusiasm soon gave way to apprehension. Within weeks, reports began to pile up. Aborted landings, failed takeoffs, violent landings, and a succession of fatal accidents. Thunderbolt was powerful, but unpredictable. Too heavy for novices, too fast for veterans accustomed to smaller aircraft. More than 40 units were lost in the first few months of training alone. The death toll has reached the dozens. At airfields from Oklahoma to Texas, the name Jug, the nickname for the P-47, came to mean, among instructors, more of an obstacle than a solution. The biggest challenge was not fighting the enemy. It was to keep men alive before they even embarked on war. The problem was in power. With the R-2800 engine delivering almost 2,000 horsepower, the acceleration at takeoff was brutal. If the pilot did not apply the rudder accurately, the aircraft would spin off the runway in seconds. The huge propeller pulled the nose hard, requiring constant corrections. On landing, the weight of the fuselage required millimeter touches. Any carelessness turned the landing gear into scrap. The seat was high, limiting visibility of the nose. The cabin is narrow, and the panel, full of instruments that frightened the less experienced. To many it looked like a plane made for veterans, but delivered to recruits. The rate of attrition with instructors has risen to alarming levels. One of them, in an official report, wrote, "We are training men to fight a war, but the first thing they fight, it's the plane." Despite this, something was beginning to change. The few who mastered the Jug reported a transformation. Once the pilot overcame the learning curve, he discovered a machine that offered stability, high-speed response, and above all, confidence. The P-47 could dive like no other. It could handle Gs that other fighters couldn't handle, and even with extensive damage, it responded to commands until the end. The more experienced instructors began to adapt the training. They incorporated long taxiing sessions, simulations of hydraulic failures, and flights dedicated only to takeoff and landing. It was a slow, expensive, and difficult process, but little by little the pilots began to understand. The Jug was not an enemy. It was a beast of burden, and if tamed, it became a fierce partner. One of the first pilots to cross this threshold was Robert S. Johnson. Still in training, it nearly abandoned the program after 3 disastrous landings, but he persisted, and soon, he would become one of the greatest aces of the war. With 27 confirmed victories all aboard a Thunderbolt, Johnson was one of the first to realize the value of armor, diving power, autonomy, and robustness. For him, the Jug was not a threat. It was life insurance. Years later in interviews, Johnson would say, "You didn't fly the Jug. You trusted him." And that trust, built at the cost of sacrifice and learning, would become the Allies' most reliable weapon in the skies over Europe. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. All it took was time, technique, and adaptation. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content about the machines, men, and decisions that shaped history. Because every number carries a story, and every machine has a soul, even if it's made of steel. But the technical challenges were far from over. Because even with the Jug's dominance on the ground, one question remained. What would happen when this plane, designed to survive, faced the real test in the skies of Europe? And what to do when the enemy, armed with 20mm cannons and led by aces with hundreds of victories, decided it was time to prove that no American plane could withstand an ambush at 30,000 feet. That answer would come in blood, fire, and a cockpit pierced by enemy bullets. And when all seemed lost, the P-47 would prove why it had been built for hell. June 26, 1943. Clear skies over occupied France. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson was flying an escort mission when it all went wrong. The formation was broken, his comrades dispersed, and he found himself alone, isolated, vulnerable at 25,000 feet, with the rear open. It was then that the attack began. 4 Focke-Wulf FW-190s dived in sync, firing short bursts of 20mm cannon and 13mm machine guns. The P-47 trembled with the impacts. Fragments flew from the fuselage. The engine lost power. The cabin was hit. Johnson took shrapnel to his face, his hands cut by the panel that exploded in front of him. Jug's nose dropped. Blood flowed. The sky turned. He tried to jump, but the cockpit was locked. Locked. He was trapped inside the metal coffin itself and being buried by gunfire. But Thunderbolt didn't go down. Even with holes in the wings, damaged flaps and black smoke escaping from the side, the aircraft remained in the air. Johnson was able to level the flight and keep the engine running at reduced power. He was injured, panicked, and flying alone over hostile territory. The hunt continued. An FW-190 approached from behind. The German pilot slowed down, lined up, and fired. Not one, but 4 full bursts. None was enough to bring down the P-47. Then, in an almost ritual act, the Luftwaffe pilot pulled up next to the wrecked American fighter, observed Johnson's bloodied face, flapped his wings in respect, and left. The enemy had surrendered to reality. That plane would not crash. Back in England, the state of the Thunderbolt shocked the technicians. There were more than 200 bullet holes and shrapnel. The cockpit armor had saved Johnson's life. The fuel tank had withstood direct fire. The structure, although torn apart, remained cohesive. The aircraft had flown more than 150 kilometers in a straight line, without escort, without communication, without instruments, bleeding oil and fuel, but flying. It was the first proof, before Allied eyes, that the Thunderbolt was not just an airplane. It was a fortress. This event, widely publicized in military intelligence, ran like an unsettling whisper among Luftwaffe pilots. How was it possible? How could an airplane of that size withstand everything? The answer lay in the technical details ignored for so long. The R-2800 was a radial engine, without a liquid cooling system. This meant that even with direct drilling, it continued to operate. The armor of the cockpit and tank was hardened steel, thick enough to contain internal explosions. The wings were built with multiple spars, structural redundancy in case of partial loss. Every component of the P-47 had been designed to absorb damage, operate at fault, and come back. And on that day, all of that was put to the test, and won. Johnson's episode has become a symbol. The joke of the flying cow began to unravel in silence. German reports began to report encounters with the großen Jägern, the big hunters, who simply wouldn't fall. A pilot of JG-26 wrote in his diary, "We fired until we ran out of ammunition." Still, he flew home. Fear began to replace mockery. Technical respect, although silent, was beginning to sprout among the aces of the Reich. What was once despised as excess was now recognized as survival. The strength of the P-47 was not just physical, it was symbolic. The Luftwaffe was accustomed to facing fragile planes, light and agile fighters that fell with a few well-placed shots. Now he faced something that absorbed, resisted, and fought back with twice as much force. The balance was beginning to change. The tactical doctrine based on individual superiority lost its effect in the face of a machine that did not play the same game. In the months since, reports of Thunderbolts returning to base with dozens of puncture wounds have become commonplace. The pilots learned to trust the hull, to keep their cool even under fire. The P-47 had gone from being a promise to becoming a bastion, and the name Robert S. Johnson would be just the first in a long line of men who, relying on heavy engineering, would come back alive to tell stories that looked like legends, but were statistics. And if one airplane was capable of that, imagine what hundreds could do, flying in waves, escorting bombers, covering hundreds of miles, pouring fire on Germany's industrial heartland. Because now, the American doctrine was ready. The enemy didn't know it, but the skies were about to change forever. From then on, it would no longer be a question of skill, but of volume. And when volume turned into precision, and precision into production, the Luftwaffe would face something it had never faced: the end of air dominance. And the harbinger of this was about to cross the skies of Normandy. When the P-47 Thunderbolt plunged from the skies at more than 700 km/h, it wasn't just its mass that caused terror, it was the sound. A dry, repetitive, almost metallic sound, which tore through the air with the regularity of a killer metronome. That sound came from 8 guns, the 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 4 on each wing, arranged symmetrically, with a convergence calculated to be about 300 meters in front of the aircraft. The result? A concentrated cone of destruction, a tunnel of death that did not require perfect aim. It was enough to be inside it. A few seconds were enough, and everything turned into wreckage. The Browning M2 was a weapon of origin in World War I, but in World War I it reached its peak. It weighed about 38 kilograms, fired 800 rounds per minute, and had an effective range of more than 1,800 meters. Each 50 caliber, 12.7 millimeter round could pierce light armor plates, drive through engines, and tear off wings. But the real strength of the M2 was in the repetition, in the relentless cadence, and the P-47 carried more than 400 rounds per weapon. In all, about 3,400 possible shots. This meant that a pilot could keep their finger on the trigger for up to 30 seconds before running out of charge. 30 seconds of concentrated fire without the need for millimeter precision, because the volume compensated for any human error. The Luftwaffe, on the other hand, bet on a combination of shorter, more explosive weapons. The Bf-109G used two 13mm MG-131s and one 20mm MG-151 gun. The FW-190A carried two 20mm cannons in the wings and machine guns in the nose. In theory, the explosive ammunition from the German guns dealt more damage per impact, but there was one detail ignored in the reports. The hit rate in real combat was extremely low. Most aerial duels took place at high speed, with evasive maneuvers and firing windows of only 2 to 3 seconds. In these short intervals, the density of American fire proved to be superior. While the German guns fired less than 500 rounds per minute, with smaller magazines and greater recoil, the 50s of the P-47s dropped a curtain of lead. It was a statistical lottery, and Americans played with more chips. In addition, the types of ammunition used by U.S. forces have been refined for different targets. There were armor-piercing, AP, incendiary, I, tracer, T, projectiles, and combinations such as APIT, armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer in a single bullet. These munitions created a hellish sequence that, when in contact with fuel tanks, detonated aircraft in mid-flight. With each burst, the pilot launched dozens of projectiles with incendiary potential. And as if the physical impact wasn't enough, there was the psychological effect. Luftwaffe pilots reported that when they were hit by a 50 blast, the sensation was that they were being crushed by a steel saw. The sound, the impact, the fire, everything was amplified by the violence of the encounter. Another decisive factor was the pattern of convergence. Unlike German fighters, which had guns centered on the nose or slightly separated on the wings, the P-47 used an adjustable pattern, where the 8 barrels were calibrated to concentrate fire on a specific point, creating a devastating, ballistic cloud. It was not necessary to aim at the enemy pilot. All you had to do was aim at the plane, and even if it missed by a few meters, the bullets would still tear surfaces, rip off flaps, render engines useless. This generous margin of error gave the American pilots a clear statistical advantage. In combat, the one who fires the perfect shot does not win. The winner is the one who shoots the most, and with enough impact to prevent the counterattack. On the battlefields of Europe, this power materialized in numbers. In 1944, units equipped with P-47 Thunderbolt destroyed more than 6,000 locomotives, 9,000 railroad cars, 3,000 armored vehicles, and thousands of aircraft on the ground. They were not surgical actions. They were systematic executions. The Thunderbolts dived in formation, fired simultaneously, and evaporated targets in seconds. Trains exploded before braking. Armored columns were torn to pieces before organizing defense. Entire airfields turned to ashes at the end of a sortie. The Germans at first tried to respond with evasive tactics. They raised the flight ceiling, increased the speed of climb, reconfigured formations. Nothing worked. The Thunderbolt's resistance to return fire was so high that American pilots took more risks, attacking in dive, traversing heavy flak, and coming out unscathed. A report from the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe of September 1944 reads, "The American Jaeger does not retreat. He absorbs the attack and continues. Our ammunition doesn't affect it quickly enough." It was the implicit recognition that the German tactical doctrine, based on maneuver and precision, had been superseded by something simpler and more brutal, the mathematics of death. And there was also the logistics behind it. The U.S. produced millions of 50 rounds per month. In 1944 alone, there were more than 2 billion cartridges. While Germany suffered from shortages of steel and gunpowder, the Americans stocked their arsenals as if preparing for an endless war. And perhaps that was exactly the difference. For the Luftwaffe, every mission was a gamble. For the USAAF, each mission was a calculated operation. The P-47 did not depend on daring. It depended on repetition. And it is at this point that fear changes sides. Because when the enemy stops believing that he can take you down, he starts to retreat even before combat. And when this retreat becomes doctrine, the war is lost. But there was still something the Luftwaffe didn't know. The Thunderbolt hadn't yet revealed its most destructive blow. He didn't just survive. It didn't just kill. He was about to take on a new mission, one that would completely transform warfare on the ground. Because heaven now belonged to him, and the battlefield was about to feel the weight of his wings. The supremacy of a machine is not born only from its engineering. It comes to fruition when someone understands how to use it differently. That's exactly what happened when American pilots began to abandon the romanticism of dogfighting, those spiral battles where winning depended on reflexes and tight maneuvers, and began to apply a cold, mathematical, and ruthless doctrine, boom and zoom. This simple but devastating tactic took advantage of exactly what the Germans despised most about the P-47 Thunderbolt, its weight and diving speed. The concept was straightforward. Maintain altitude, dive at high speed over enemy formations, fire in short bursts, and climb back up before any response could be organized. No sharp turns, no prolonged combat, no chance for the opponent. Who first systematized this doctrine was Walker Bud Mahurin, one of the first American aces to operate Thunderbolt on a large scale. Mahurin understood early on that the weight of the aircraft, coupled with the power of the R-2800 engine, made the P-47 a diving predator. Rather than trying to keep up with the Bf-109s or FW-190s on lateral maneuvers, where the Germans still had the upper hand, he taught his squadrons to hunt from above with gravity as an ally, dive at more than 800 km/h, fire a precise gust with the 850 and immediately climb, leaving behind only smoke and confusion. The success was immediate. American losses fell, while culling reports increased exponentially. The Luftwaffe, accustomed to protracted fighting and head-on confrontations, found itself dealing with ghosts that appeared and disappeared within seconds. This style of combat transformed the sky. Air warfare has ceased to be a duel and has become a tactical execution. The altitude advantage has become an absolute requirement. And in this, the Americans had a structural advantage. Thanks to the P-47's superchargers, they could operate at full power at more than 30,000 feet. Altitudes where German engines with limited mechanical turbocharging were already beginning to lose steam. Boom and zoom was the perfect marriage of doctrine and machine. The Thunderbolt didn't have to win in the spin. He won on impact. The change was so drastic that in mid-1944, the Luftwaffe itself began to instruct its pilots to avoid confrontation with the P-47s at high altitudes. One of the German combat manuals recommended, "Do not dive against American heavy fighters. Wait for them to rise. Attack only when they slow down." It was the implicit acknowledgement of the Thunderbolt's tactical and energetic superiority. But in practice, waiting for the P-47 to go up was waiting for nothing. Because American doctrine did not allow for prolonged engagement. They came, attacked, and disappeared before any reaction could be organized. It was like fighting thunder. You heard the impact when it was too late. And all of this was supported by a logistical base that the Germans were never able to reach. While the Luftwaffe reorganized with difficulty, dealing with shortages of fuel, pilots, and parts, the U.S. produced Thunderbolts on a brutal scale. Between 1943 and 1944 alone, more than 10,000 units were manufactured. For every German fighter shot down, another P-47 was already en route to combat. The production of .50 caliber ammunition was so plentiful that many missions returned without having exhausted their weaponry, and yet they recorded multiple targets destroyed. It was a war of repetition, and the boom and zoom turned every repetition into a death statistic. The Luftwaffe still tried to adapt. They tried low-altitude traps, rotating formations, cloud ambushes, but nothing stopped the jugs. They came from above with speed and armor, and the cruelest thing, they almost always came back. In a single month of operations on the Western Front, The 56th Fighter Group, equipped exclusively with P-47s, recorded 103 enemy aircraft destroyed and lost only 15 planes in combat. The mathematics of war had changed, and Germany was on the wrong side of the equation. This new paradigm was evident in the German pilots' own testimonies. In an interrogation conducted by the RAF, a captured pilot stated, "You don't fight the jug, you can only survive it." It was a simple sentence, but loaded with psychological surrender. The presence of the P-47 in the sky was not just a threat, it was a certainty, and this corroded morale. If the German driver was lucky, he would escape the first gust. If he was even luckier, he would not be attacked. But luck in modern warfare was a vanishing resource. And if there was still any doubt about the impact of this tactical change, just look at the numbers. By 1944, the victory rate of P-47 units in the skies over Europe exceeded 5-1, 5 enemies shot down for every Thunderbolt lost. This superiority was unprecedented. It was the silent collapse of a German doctrine that relied too much on individual talent and underestimated the cumulative effect of mass production, tactical discipline, and science applied to combat. By the way, it's worth a break here. Many Luftwaffe reports simply ignored one essential fact. The United States produced more fighters per month than Germany did in 6 months. More than 96,000 aircraft were built in 1944 alone. That's right, 96,000. If this number impressed you, comment there. Logistics wins, because in the end that's what turned the tide. But the sky was not yet the limit. The doctrine of boom and zoom was just the beginning. The P-47 still carried something else, something that did not come from his cabin nor from his cannons. It came under his wings. Thunderbolt was about to reveal a new face, and when it did, the entire battlefield, from air to ground, would feel the impact, because the war was about to go vertical, and the P-47 would be the hammer that would crush the backbone of the German war machine. Between April and August 1943, combat reports began to expose a trend that the Luftwaffe did not want to see, but that was already becoming impossible to ignore. The number of German fighters shot down grew month after month. In April, 206 aircraft lost. In May, 291. In June, 340. July closed with 403. And August, with more than 500. At the same time, the Thunderbolts were returning home. Pierced, burned, sometimes in radio silence, but they came back. The P-47's return rate after sorties over France and Western Germany exceeded 85%. It was an equation that undermined the morale of any commander. Lose 4 pilots and shoot down 1. The doctrine of German air superiority, which had been built on agility and individual merit, was beginning to implode under the weight of arithmetic. Because now, every time a group of Focke-Wulfs took off to intercept an American squadron, the question was not, how many are we going to shoot down, but how many are we going to lose? German intelligence tried to react. In internal meetings at the OKL, the Luftwaffe's high command, technical dossiers on the P-47 began to circulate. One of them, dated August 17, 1943, read, "The American P-47 fighter must be treated as a priority. Its armor is superior to that of previous models, and its fire resistance requires greater impact volume. Pilots report that even after direct hits, the jug maintains stability and returns." It was the formal recognition that something had changed. It wasn't just another enemy plane. It was a system, a complete package: engine, armor, armament, altitude, endurance, and speed. The enemy now flew with a winged tank, but it was not only in the air that the presence of the P-47 was felt. The Thunderbolt had been adapted to carry bombs of 500, 1,000, and even 2,500 pounds under the wings. And with that, a new chapter began: the war on the ground. The Jabot missions, as the Germans nicknamed the fighter bombers, came to haunt roads, railways, and gas stations. The word Jabot, derived from Jagbomber, began to appear in the diaries of soldiers and drivers with an increasingly somber tone. It was not uncommon for entire trains to stop at the slightest sound of engines in the sky. The psychological impact was visible. Many German soldiers began to disobey orders to keep marching during the day. Waiting for the jug's attack had become part of the routine. A Wehrmacht soldier reported, "If we hear a dry thunderclap, it's too late. The Jabots have arrived." The Jabot fever spread quickly. Frontline troops were calling for more anti-aircraft guns. Quartermaster officers changed supply routes. The rail network, already strained by strategic bombing, began to collapse with the precision strikes of the Thunderbolts. On a single day in July 1943, 312 locomotives were reported hit by P-47s on tactical missions. The Luftwaffe, until then accustomed to reacting to heavy bombers, was now confronted with hundreds of fighter bombers operating in decentralized, fast, lethal, and constant squadrons. The battlefront, which was once linear, now received blows from multiple points, coming from the sky, without warning, without pattern. This decentralization was another fruit of American logistics. While Germany suffered from shortages of fuel, parts, and experienced pilots, the United States distributed the P-47 to dozens of air groups, each with tactical autonomy, to act according to the local scenario. There were more than 40,000 pilots trained for fighter and escort operations alone. And every month more men and more planes arrived. The enemy was not only facing aircraft, it faced an ecosystem. The P-47 was just the spearhead of a chain that involved factories, sea lanes, training grounds, interlocking commands, and a doctrine that allowed for constant adaptation. And at this point the irony was unbearable for the Germans. The plane that had been ridiculed for its weight and size was now feared for its versatility. The Luftwaffe, which had bet on lean, sleek fighters, was faced with a metal monster that not only fought, but won in any role. A report by the 2nd Panzer Division, written after the withdrawal from Caen, sums up the terror accurately. There is no way to move troops in the open without being attacked by the fighter bombers. American artillery comes from the sky, and it shoots continuously. Guderian's doctrine, which called for speed, mobility, and deep penetration into enemy territory, simply didn't work when columns of armor were shredded before they reached combat. Each P-47 could fly nearly 1,000 kilometers on a full load. They left their base in southern England, crossed the Channel, attacked targets in the French or German countryside, and back, all in one mission. And with P-51 escorts arriving in the European theater in late 1943, the P-47 was able to focus more and more on ground attack missions, further amplifying its impact. But the real collapse was not tactical. It was ideological. The Luftwaffe had been built on the idea of local air dominance, on the skill of aces, on the primacy of agility, and the art of combat. Now he saw that vision crumble in the face of an air force that sought not elegance, but efficiency, that it did not depend on legendary pilots but on standardized systems, and that he understood that modern war is not won with a bullet at the right moment, but with thousands of shots, every day, everywhere. And this abyss was still going to grow, because soon, the Thunderbolts would no longer operate only in tactical missions. They would be called to something greater, an attack that was not only aimed at columns and train lines, but the Reich's own industrial foundations. And when that happened, the sound of the 50s would no longer be just a threat to the soldier. It would become the sound of national collapse, because the next target, it would be the heart of the German war machine. On the morning of October 8, 1943, the sky over Germany seemed suspended in silence, an icy, rarefied void at more than 30,000 feet. It was up there, where the air became an invisible enemy, that Hans Philipp, one of the greatest aces of the Luftwaffe, flew on a mission. With more than 200 confirmed victories, Philipp was a living legend among German drivers. Experienced since the Battle of France, a veteran of the Eastern Front, decorated and respected, he believed he knew all the rhythms of air warfare. But that day would not follow any of the patterns he mastered. In front of him, a formation of B-17 bombers escorted by a new type of enemy, fast, impassive, and rising like metallic rockets. They were P-47 Thunderbolts. And they were no longer there to survive, they were there to hunt. Philippe was flying an FW-190A-6, a lethal machine at medium altitudes, but with severe limitations above 25,000 feet. The BMW 801 engines, although robust, did not have the necessary compression to maintain full performance at high altitudes. The P-47s, with their two-stage superchargers and liquid intake air cooling, operated at full power even above 9,000 meters. The technical difference was brutal. While the German engine lost steam and torque, the American radial maintained thrust, speed, and response. This technological asymmetry turned every American dive into a death sentence, especially when pilots knew they could dive, fire, and simply climb back up without risk of being followed. Philipp, veteran that he was, knew this. But on that day, The mission required intercepting the bombardment force advancing toward Bremen, and in the air theater of northern Germany, there was no more room for hesitation. The radios were congested, the sky dotted with V-shapes, tracers crossing the void, anti-aircraft bursts, and small silvery dots that moved with impossible speed. As he approached the formation, Philip identified the Thunderbolts at higher altitude. He tried to go up. He tried to stop the fight, but what followed was not a battle. It was a technical execution. The American report of that mission was concise. P-47, approach and dive, target FW-190, multiple bursts fired. FW-190 seen exploding after direct hit. No parachute. Hans Philipp, the legendary ace, went down in seconds. Neither his reflexes, nor his skill, nor his hundreds of victories mattered. He had faced a weapon he could not fight with experience, a machine that replaced instinct with repetition, elegance with power. Philipp's death was a symbol, a silent divider, because from there it was clear to everyone that the Luftwaffe wasn't just losing aircraft, it was losing its best men. The elite was beginning to disappear, one by one. Philipp's fall reverberated internally as a seismic shock. The next day, the German Air Command published an internal memorandum warning of the urgent need for new defensive methods in the face of the technical superiority of enemy fighters at high altitude. It was the official recognition of an asymmetry that was already too expensive. The number of aces killed or wounded that year had multiplied. Pilots with more than 50 victories, who had previously dictated the pace of battles, now became targets. The Luftwaffe, struggling to train new pilots, could not replace the losses, and the rookies, rushed to the front, faced machines that did not forgive mistakes. The balance had tipped over, and the myth of German invincibility began to unravel, not in speeches but in destroyed fighter jets and radio silences. By this time, Thunderbolt was no longer seen as an aberration. He was feared as a predator. German pilots began to report the sound of the 850s as an omen. "When we heard that sound, we were already being hit," wrote a JG-2 pilot. And now, they knew that not even heroes escaped. The very figure of the ace, so romanticized by Nazi propaganda, was beginning to crumble. Because in the end, what mattered was not the man's experience but the capacity of the machine, and the scale of production that kept those machines in the air, day after day, mission after mission. But Philipp's death also revealed another hidden factor: Germany's strategic failure to develop an effective high-altitude combat system. While the Americans operated fighters with superchargers and designs designed for layered warfare, the Luftwaffe still bet on aircraft optimized for the Eastern Front and tactical missions. Adaptation was slow, expensive, and, in the end, insufficient. The TA-152, successor to the FW-190 with high-altitude performance, only saw combat in minimal numbers. When he arrived, it was too late, and the P-47s, now free of the stigma, flew like lords of the skies. The mission of October 8th was only one of hundreds, but it was there that the symbol of German tactical dominance was slaughtered, and the next day, a new convoy of jugs was already crossing the English Channel, because the American plan was simple: fly, attack, return, fly again, attack again, until there was no more resistance. And the next mission would have an even bigger target: no longer an ace, no longer a locomotive, but the industry that sustained the Luftwaffe itself. Philipp's death was the prelude. The bombing of Schweinfurt would be the coup. The sound came before the vision, a deep, dry, swaying roar like thunder tearing through the sky. German soldiers in the trenches of Anzio reported that they could hear it for seconds before any dark spots appeared on the horizon. It was the new sound of war, and it didn't come from a bomber. It came from a fighter jet. It was the P-47 D-22, equipped with a seemingly simple, but devastating, innovation: the wide-bladed propeller. Introduced in mid-1944, this modification elevated Thunderbolt to a new category of performance. With 4 enlarged and redesigned blades, its R-2800 engine now poured its power with much greater efficiency, transforming an already feared plane into something truly unstoppable. The rate of climb, one of the only weaknesses of the original model, has been brutally corrected. The P-47 D-22 and its successors didn't just attack, they reached for the skies with the speed of a projectile. Vertical maneuvers became his specialty. The Germans, who had previously laughed at the slow ascent of the Jug, could now no longer get away from it. But there was something even more striking. The sound. The new blades, with a larger area and wider tip when rotating at high speed, created a rare acoustic effect. When their ends reached transonic speeds, surpassing the sound locally, they generated a unique sound signature, a mechanical distorted thunder with frequency variations that echoed over forests, villages, and roads. It was as if the sky vibrated before it was hit, and to those on the ground, that sound meant only one thing: death was coming, and it was coming at high speed. There was no mistaking it. It was the announcement of the P-47 in diving, a sound that, for many German soldiers, was more feared than the impact itself. Technically, this propeller, known as the paddle blade, was a direct response to the demands of veteran pilots who asked for better performance at medium and high altitudes. It allowed the engine to operate at higher loads without overheating, improved acceleration in dive, and gave the Thunderbolt a gain of nearly 2,200 feet per minute in rate of climb. That meant one thing: the Jug could now reach the bombers it escorted, engage enemy fighters on equal footing in altitude, and most importantly, surprise them from the bottom up. The vertical advantage was consolidated. While Republic aviation engineers implemented these improvements in record time, Germany collapsed technically. The German aircraft industry faced constant bombardment, a shortage of special metal alloys, a shortage of engines, and the loss of entire factories. The introduction of new models such as the FW-190D or the ME-262 was held back by a lack of mass production, and even existing fighters began to fail due to the absence of spare parts. In contrast, the U.S. not only maintained production, it improved its designs in monthly cycles. The P-47 variants evolved like a living line, adapting to the demands of the battlefield. The Model D, with its wide-bladed propeller, was no exception. It was the new standard. This superiority of adaptation was directly reflected in the reports from the front. A document from the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe from September 1944 warned, "The new versions of the P-47 show superior climb performance than our fighters at certain altitudes. It is recommended to avoid direct engagement, prioritizing low-altitude ambushes." It was a confession disguised as doctrine. The recommendation to avoid head-on confrontation was the recognition that even the most modern Luftwaffe planes, such as the FW-190A8 or the last Bf-109G, were being overtaken by a plane that, 2 years earlier, had been considered obsolete at its birth. And most impressively, the U.S. didn't have to choose between performance and production. The new propellers, engines, and adjustments did not slow down the assembly line. By 1944, the United States was producing more than 600 P-47s per month. Meanwhile, Germany could barely replace weekly losses. Each Jug that took off brought not only technology, but also doctrine and logistics, and that made the difference. The new models came integrated with upgraded VHF radios, refined oxygen systems, a K-14 gyro sight, and external tank mounts, allowing for even more range. The machine was constantly evolving, not only to resist, but to dominate. The presence of the wide-bladed P-47D became a milestone on the battlefield. British reports described the sound difference between the previous and new models. An RAF official even noted, "When we hear the deepest thunder, we know that the improved version is in the field, and with it come results." It was a war where even the sound carried a tactical meaning. This continuous evolution was not a mere luxury. It was pure strategy. By adapting and improving its main fighter in the midst of war, the U.S. didn't just respond to the threat, it anticipated it. For every move by the Luftwaffe, there was a countermeasure developing. For every German innovation, an answer was already being tested. The difference between the two sides at this point in the war was no longer one of model against model. It was system against system. And the American system, with its ability to innovate without stopping the assembly line, was winning by inertia, by quantity, and by quality at the same time. But this story still had more to reveal, because if the sound of the propeller was frightening, what would come next would be even more relentless. The new versions of the P-47 were about to carry something other than bombs and bullets. They would carry with them a new type of sight, a system so precise, so advanced, that it would turn any ordinary pilot into a surgical threat. The roar announced the arrival. But now, the shot would be millimetrically calculated, and the next part will reveal how American targeting technology put an end to the German advantage in the skies. From mid-1944, the sound that crossed the fields of Normandy no longer belonged exclusively to the sky. It was an extension of the battlefield, a new type of artillery, mobile, fast, autonomous, that tore through the German columns before they even had time to react. The P-47, once limited to the role of escort fighter, now plunged furiously over tanks, trucks, warehouses, and strategic intersections. Armed with 500-kilogram bombs under each wing, plus high-penetration HVAR rockets, he had become the terror of the panzer divisions. On ground attack missions, their impact was absolute. Columns of vehicles decimated, warehouses exploding in chains, roads transformed into metal graveyards. The fighter had transformed itself into a light bomber, with the advantage of being fast, accurate, and practically indestructible. The number of locomotives destroyed by P-47s by the end of the war would exceed 9,000, wagons more than 86,000. One pilot described the feeling of diving over an armored division as dumping hell with method, and Allied reports confirmed it. Where the Thunderbolts operated, resistance retreated. The change was not just about weapons, it was doctrinal. Allied Air Command recognized that the P-47 could do more than protect. He could make his way. Thus, starting with the Normandy campaign, Thunderbolt squadrons were given specific tactical interdiction missions. His orders were simple: prevent any German movement during the day, attack moving targets, logistics centers, railway stations, trains, and bridges, to make every kilometer of German retreat a martyrdom, and the machine responded with industrial efficiency, capable of carrying more than 1,000 kilograms of bombs without compromising its flight performance. The Jug was adapted to operate as a pure fighter bomber. His 8.50 machine guns, already deadly in their own right, now accompanied rockets and high-fragmentation explosives. The sky began to pour out precision, and the Germans had no answer. During Operation Cobra, the American offensive to break through German lines in Normandy, the P-47 flew more than 5,000 sorties in a few days, and in just 1 week, more than 1,500 German vehicles were destroyed or rendered useless by tactical airstrikes, the overwhelming majority by Thunderbolts. It was a new pattern of warfare. Ground advancement depended on air control, and the Jugs guaranteed this control with method, routine, and repetition. The tanks did not advance without their cover. The infantry did not march without its cleansing. A new kind of coordination was emerging between heaven and earth, uniting radio, maps, and timed attacks with surgical precision. The American army no longer attacked alone. It was preceded by a cloud of steel and fire. And the most brutal detail of this equation was constancy. P-47 pilots flew up to 3 missions a day. They left the bases in England or the rear in France, crossed the sky, and dived over targets signaled by observers. They refueled, rearmed, and returned. And every day more planes arrived. More bombs fell. More rails were torn from the ground. More armored vehicles burned. While the Luftwaffe tried to fight back with scarce fighters, often powered by low-quality synthetic fuel, the skies were increasingly dominated. Air supremacy was no longer a concept. It became an everyday fact. The sound of the Thunderbolt in diving became, for many German soldiers, the final warning. A burst of 50s, a rocket ripping through the air, and then nothing. And all of this was possible because there was a machine behind the machine. American production of P-47s exceeded 15,000 units by the end of the war. On average, the U.S. manufactured a P-47 every 55 minutes. Yes, you heard that right. Every 55 minutes, a new unit was ready for the front. Compared to the numbers in Germany, which struggled to maintain a weekly production of a few hundred fighters of various models, many of them with technical problems and low availability of parts, the contrast is brutal. If this statistic surprised you, leave a word in the comments that represents this impact. Absolute power, logistics wins, or simply unbelievable. The psychological impact of this repetition machine was visible. German troops began to prevent movements during the day. The movement of armored vehicles was reorganized for the night. Supply trucks traveled on back roads, under trees, in silence. But even so, the Thunderbolts found them. A system of aerial observation, tactical intelligence, and coordination with troops on the ground made it possible to identify patterns and anticipate movements. The Wehrmacht was being asphyxiated, not just for lack of fuel or parts, but for fear. A constant routine fear of looking up and seeing the metallic glow of a diving Jug. And there was something else. something that neither the Germans nor the Allies themselves had foreseen. The P-47, on its mission as a fighter bomber, began assembling a destruction database. Each mission generated reports, impact maps, damage estimates. The engineers analyzed every hit, every failure, and so, the doctrine improved. The targets were no longer generic. Now there was focus: ammunition depots, communication centers, strategic railroad crossings. It was destruction with intelligence, and that made the Jug, literally, a flying tactical annihilation factory. But what impressed me most was its durability. Even though it was carrying bombs, flying low, and diving under anti-aircraft fire, the P-47 kept coming back. The armor of the engine, the cabin, the hydraulic systems, everything had been designed to absorb impact and keep going. A pilot hit in the middle of a bombing mission could still return, and he returned. It was a metallic monster that bled, but did not fall, and as long as it kept flying, the front would keep moving forward. And this breakthrough was about to reach a new level, because the next target would not be a truck nor a locomotive. It would be a vital facility for the German war effort, a centerpiece in the machinery of the Reich, and the attack would come from above, in multiple waves, with precision, fury, and a sound that the German soldiers already knew well, the sound that announced that there was nowhere else to run, because the next chapter would not only bring tactical destruction, it would bring about strategic collapse. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, as the first landing boats cut through the icy waters of the English Channel, there was something hovering over the beaches of Normandy that came neither from the sea nor from the land. It was a moving shadow, a continuous roar, a sky that was no longer contested. Above the heads of every Allied soldier landing in Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, flew metallic shields with propellers spinning in fury. They were the P-47 Thunderbolts. More than 500 of them crossed the sky that day, in coordinated shifts, forming what the generals called an absolute air umbrella. No German aircraft would touch that sky safely, and almost none of them tried. The mission was clear: to keep the airspace clean, to support the landings with surgical strikes, and to prevent any German mechanized counter-offensive from approaching the beaches. In all these tasks, Thunderbolt has delivered with mathematical precision. Equipped with HVAR rockets, 500-kilogram bombs, and 850 machine guns, they swept through intersections, roads, and forests before infantry even spotted the first bunker. Forward observers on the ground radioed the pilots, marking targets with smoke or mirrors. Coordination was so refined that some squadrons completed 3 sorties before noon. Each flight meant fewer tanks, fewer reinforcements, less artillery in the hands of the enemy. The Luftwaffe, once feared, practically did not attend. Of the more than 1,500 fighters available in France at the beginning of the year, fewer than 300 were operational as of June, and even those were kept away from the landing zone by a combination of systematic bombing, fuel shortages, and merciless interceptions. Wolfgang Fischer, one of the few German pilots who took off that morning, tried to reach the beaches to assess the situation. It crossed the sky of Brittany, climbed to 20,000 feet, and began to descend. As he approached the coastal area, he was greeted by an invisible wall. In his words, heaven was no longer heaven. It was a death camp. Each cloud had eyes. Every ray of sunlight brought an attack. His FW-190 was hit in the wings, lost stability, and began to spin. He managed to regain control, but never made it to shore. He came back alone. Of the 12 fighters that took off with it, only 2 returned. The others were shot down, probably before they even saw the sea. Allied reports from that morning confirm no German attack missions were successful on D-Day. Heaven was 100% Allied. And this was no coincidence. It was the direct result of an aerial attrition campaign, driven by a machine that had been designed just for that. The P-47, with its absurd endurance, autonomy extended by external tanks, and ability to operate at low and medium altitude with equal effectiveness, was the executor of this domination. Every plane that flew there had undergone intensive training, top-notch maintenance, and a supply chain that ran like an industrial clock. And behind each pilot, there was a production line that didn't stop. More planes were always ready, more parts were always available, more ammunition arriving by ships and rails every day. This total dominance was not just tactical, it was symbolic. What started as a ridiculed airplane, seen by the Germans as a flying wreck, was now the wall of heaven. The very nature of the war had changed. It was no longer a question of who flew better, but who flew the most, who always flew, who controlled the air as an extension of their infrastructure. And in this respect, the United States had won long before the first shot on the beaches. Victory was embedded in the Indiana factories, the Kansas railroad lines, the Florida flight tests. The P-47 was the tip of a spear, built by thousands of unseen hands. Even the German commanders admitted impotence. An internal report of the Oberkommando of the Wehrmacht, dated June 10th, states, "The absence of the Luftwaffe in Normandy is no longer a question of planning, but of impossibility." The conclusion was brutal. There was no more heaven for the Germans. And without the sky there was no way to hold positions, move reserves, or hold off the Allied advance. Air supremacy wasn't just a concept, it was a sentence. The P-47 now didn't just fly, it decreed the time of war. The time of attack, the time of retreat, the time of surrender. But if the Germans thought the worst was over, they were wrong. What would come after D-Day would not only be the ground advance, but the continuation of an air offensive that did not retreat, did not pause, did not tire. And the next target was already set, the logistical heart of Germany, the roads, the rails, the depots. The P-47, which had started as a fighter and had become artillery, would now also be the executor of the paralysis, because an army without supply is an army that has already lost. And the next part of the story would reveal exactly how the Thunderbolt turned the Allied advance into an avalanche that was impossible to contain. On the Western Front, the war had ceased to be just physical. With each new dawn, German troops buried in makeshift positions in the forests of France, Belgium, and Holland awoke to the same sound, a muffled, grave, soaring roar. No tanks came. There were no steps. Engines came. Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engines, spinning four-bladed propellers at transonic speeds. It was the sound of something invisible, but absolutely present. And for thousands of Reich soldiers, that sound wasn't just the harbinger of an attack. It was a psychological trigger. They called him Jabo, abbreviation for Jagdbomber, fighter bomber. But the name was not enough. Over time, they created another term, Jabo fever, the fighter bomber fever. It wasn't official, but it spread as a collective diagnosis. Hand tremors, nausea, cold sweat, rapid heartbeat, sudden paralysis, even full-blown nervous breakdowns. Not before the battle, but before the sound. German Army medical reports in 1944 began to record a new category of disability. Perfectly healthy soldiers who collapsed hours before their units were deployed in exposed areas. The cause? The anticipated fear of air raids. Doctors reported episodes of vomiting without physical explanation, auditory hallucinations, severe insomnia. A soldier captured in the Ardennes confessed to Allied interrogators, "I listened to the jugs even when the sky was clear. The sound was already in my head." The Luftwaffe, increasingly absent, could offer no consolation. Panzer divisions, lacking air cover, became walking targets. Even camouflage, once effective, was now insufficient. The Thunderbolts flew low, used observers on the ground, operated in pairs, in trios, in waves, anytime, anywhere. A report from the Oberkommando das Heer of September 1944 describes the phenomenon in clinical terms. The psychological impact of enemy fighter bombers on the rear lines seriously compromises combat readiness. Units deployed during the day often refuse to proceed. Men remain static even under direct orders. The fear of air raid outweighs the fear of court-martial. It was the surrender of the mind before the surrender of arms, and this surrender was silent. It did not produce visible statistics, but it eroded the base of German resistance from within. A retreating army, already logistically pressured, now faced an invisible enemy that did not sleep. The tactics of the Thunderbolt pilots contributed to this effect. Many flew at very low altitudes, just a few meters above the trees, rising to the horizon in seconds, firing rockets and machine guns, and disappearing, without warning, no alarm, only the sudden explosion, the smell of burning oil, and the silence after the damage. The reaction time was nil. Anti-aircraft defenses were insufficient, if they existed, and even if they fired, the P-47 absorbed damage that would destroy any other plane. It was common to see jugs returning to base with parts of their wings destroyed, flaps torn off, landing gear broken, and even then, landing. It was a type of invulnerability that generated frustration. The soldiers fired angrily, and then stopped shooting. Some reports indicate that entire units threw themselves into ditches at the slightest sound of engines in the sky. It didn't matter if it was an ally or an enemy. It was the conditioned reflex of survival. Fear began to alter the hours of operations. German troops began to move exclusively at night. Even simple missions such as fueling or rotating positions have been rescheduled to take place after sunset. The day began to be avoided. And with that, the effectiveness of the German war machine dropped dramatically. Trucks broke down without parts. Troops went days without supplies. Officers hesitated to order moves, fearing to lose entire convoys. The command structure itself began to fragment, and at the heart of it was not a major ground offensive. It was a fighter bomber that had been ridiculed in 1943, but now flew as the permanent shadow of defeat. The statistics of this phase of the war are revealing. Between July and December 1944, the P-47 is estimated to have been responsible for the destruction of more than 3,500 ground vehicles. This includes trucks, armored vehicles, reconnaissance cars, and supply vehicles. Most of these targets were not in combat. They were moving, trying to get away, trying to refuel, and yet, it did not escape. The fusion of air logistics, tactical observation, and heavy weaponry created a cycle that was impossible to break, and the Germans knew. In a confidential October report, a general on the Western Front wrote, "Enemy air superiority is no longer an advantage. It's a sentence, and the execution comes from above." The most brutal thing is that this sentence was applied continuously. No rest, no relay. The P-47 was refueled, rearmed, and returned. And he returned. And he returned. American factories did not stop. The maintenance line kept each plane operational for weeks without failure. Pilots were trained, rotated, replaced, but squadrons as entities remained constant. It was like fighting a mechanical swarm, an enemy that did not tire, that he did not make mistakes, that came from all sides, and that, even when slaughtered, was already being manufactured on the other side of the ocean. And the most perverse of all, the sound of the wide blades cutting through the air, the sound of the radial engine at full throttle, a dry, metallic, guttural thunder. It was the sound that the German soldiers feared more than any bomb, because that sound meant that the attack would come, and that they couldn't stop it. The sound that, a year earlier, provoked laughter, and that now caused panic. A sound that, even absent, echoed in the minds of the survivors. It was the sound of the end, and he was about to reach the gates of Germany itself, because as soldiers collapsed on the roads of France, a new mission was approaching. A coordinated, massive attack, directed not just at tanks or convoys, but at the beating heart of the Reich's military capability. And this time, there would be nowhere to run. The war was won in the sky, yes, but it began on the ground, and the American floor did not sleep. In 1943, as German pilots laughed at the grotesque shape of the P-47, an assembly line in Farmingdale, New York, began to spin with the precision of an industrial clock. On the other side of the country in Evansville, Indiana, another factory was taking on the same pace. There were two centers pulsating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, each riding a Thunderbolt fighter every 55 minutes. What the Germans called the flying barrel was actually the end product of a production chain that defied any European model of warfare. A single P-47 required more than 65,000 individual parts, 2,000 pounds of aluminum, 8 miles of electrical cables, 8 machine guns, 2 external tanks, hydraulics, navigational instruments, radio armor, ejection seat, supercharger, R-2800 engine, and 4-bladed Curtiss propellers. All of this was assembled by civilian workers, mostly women, teenagers, migrant workers, and veterans of other industries. Many of them had never seen an airplane before, but they all operated under the same principle: speed, precision, volume. While the Luftwaffe struggled to keep its fighters running, sabotaged by shortages of synthetic fuel, skilled manpower, and constant attacks on the Reich's industrial centers, the United States functioned as an expanding organism. An army of riveters, welders, electricians, and civil engineers worked in 3 continuous shifts. No line stopped. Ammunition factories were delivering millions of 50 rounds a month. General Electric produced superchargers as if they were car parts. Republic Aviation received parts from 44 different states. transported by rails and trucks that operated at coordinated schedules with military precision. There was no shortage. There was excess. There was planning. There was redundancy. If one piece failed, another was already on the way. If one engine was delayed, another was already in stock. American industry had been redesigned for a single goal: to create combat machines on an industrial scale, the likes of which had never been seen before in history. This abundance was not just material, it was psychological. Every pilot who got on a P-47 knew he wasn't alone. He knew that his plane was replaceable, his bullets infinite, his mission backed by a structure that would not break. And this knowledge altered behavior in combat. Pilots could take more risks, descend lower, attack more aggressively. Logistical support gave them tactical freedom. The enemy, on the other hand, thought twice before taking off. German pilots knew that every fighter lost was an almost irreparable loss, that each damaged engine represented days or weeks of waiting, that every production line destroyed by American bombing needed to be relocated, fragmented, hidden. Germany produced good planes, but each one was a Herculean effort. The United States produced in series, like someone who prints paper. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them from the beginning. It wasn't about daring maneuvers or elegant designs. It was about numbers, brutally applied engineering. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts and seeing how the invisible power of factories has shaped the battlefield, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth behind-the-scenes content on military history. By 1944, total production of P-47s exceeded 15,000 examples. It was the most produced airplane in American history until then, and he didn't fly alone. Behind each squadron were sea convoys, depots, mobile workshops, ground crews, logistical commands, and route planning. It was a machine that supported itself, a closed system of production and execution. The Luftwaffe had no way to keep up, not for lack of courage, but for lack of steel, made of rubber, copper, of engines, of food, of men. The American machine grew. The German machine was shrinking. And even so, the war was not yet decided. There was still resistance. There were still fortified cities. There were still frozen forests and troops willing to die fighting. But the scales had already been broken. American industry was not only the engine of the war, it was the battlefield itself, invisible, relentless, invincible. And in the coming weeks, the P-47 would no longer be just a symbol of Air Force. It would become something even more brutal, the executor of total paralysis. Because when the German logistical columns began to disappear from the maps, the generals understood. It wasn't just an airplane, it was a hammer. And the next target would be the backbone of the Reich. On the frigid dawn of January 1st, 1945, when fog still covered the icy fields of Belgium and the Netherlands, the Luftwaffe played its last desperate card. They called it Unternehmen Bodenplatte, Operation Bottom Plate. It was an attempted surgical coup against the Allied air forces. The plan was simple, almost suicidal: destroy as many Allied fighters and bombers on the ground as possible, paving the way for the Ardennes offensive to regain momentum. Nearly 900 German planes were mobilized. Most of them are manned by inexperienced pilots, many with less than 40 hours of flight time. Dozens did not even know how to operate instruments in low visibility, but they flew. They flew because there were no other options, because the war was already being decided without them, and they needed, at least for a day, to regain the initiative. The first attacks were surprising. Airfields such as Asch, Brux, and Metz suffered real damage. Workshops were destroyed, tents burned, fighter jets exploded while still on the ground. Some American riders were shot down before they could even put their boots on the asphalt. It seemed for a moment like a glimpse of the old Luftwaffe, an echo of 1940. But that was it, an echo, because at the end of the day, although the Germans destroyed about 250 Allied aircraft, they lost more than 300 of theirs. Many shot down by friendly fire, others by crashing during landing, and most by the already reorganized air defenses. Allied damage, while visible, was essentially superficial. Aircraft were replaced in record time. Mobile workshops were already in operation before sunset. At some bases, new Thunderbolts arrived before the debris of the previous ones was removed. On January 2nd, just 24 hours after the attack, an image caught the attention of a German pilot taken prisoner in Saint-Tron. He expected to see destruction, craters, empty hangars. Instead, he saw rows of gleaming P-47s, lined up for takeoff. Pilots walked calmly, ammunition being loaded, fuel filled, as if nothing had happened. The prisoner, incredulous, asked an American officer how they could have missed so many planes and still continue operating normally. The answer came dry, without pride, but with the coldness of someone who represents an industrial empire. We lost 40 yesterday. Tomorrow we will have 40 new ones. How many riders are you going to replace? That phrase, attributed to Major George Brooking, circulated among prisoner interrogators over the next few days. It was more than sarcasm. It was an epitaph for German air doctrine. The Luftwaffe, once Europe's most feared force, was reduced to operating on hurried recruits, poor quality fuel, and fighters produced in factories hidden in caves and tunnels. The Americans, by contrast, had trained pilots, spare parts, fuel in abundance, and pristine factories, churning out day and night, while bells still rang in the small towns of Indiana and New York. Bodenplatte was not only a tactical failure, it was a strategic confession. Germany recognized that it no longer controlled the sky, and that even on the ground it could not break the flow of machinery coming from across the ocean. For many historians, that day marked the symbolic end of the air war in Europe. The P-47s, as well as the Mustangs and Lightnings, continued to fly as if nothing had happened. Bombing missions resumed on the afternoon of the 1st. Anti-tank patrols resumed in full force within 48 hours. The airfields, which the Germans wanted to erase from the map, returned to operating with more force than before. It was like fighting water. You hit one point, and the next instant, the surface is back to normal. No German plan, no matter how well executed, could break a logistical system with this level of elasticity. Operation Bodenplatte was the Luftwaffe's last coordinated attempt to change the course of the war. And what was supposed to be a psychological blow became a symbol of desperation. The Allied generals did not have to alter their plans. No offensive was canceled. No division was left without air support. The damage was absorbed like a scratch on a wall. What was seen in the following days was the opposite effect to that desired by the Germans. The intensification of air attacks. The hunt for tanks increased. Railway lines were destroyed more precisely. Entire cities were isolated. And with that, the German troops lost their last illusion of air resistance. The Luftwaffe had not only lost planes, he had lost what was left of his soul. He had lost the ability to dream of twists and turns. And meanwhile, American hangars kept stacking fuselages, each one with 8 machine guns, a roaring propeller, and the sound of the end. And if the German generals thought they had seen it all, they were mistaken, because the next chapter of this story would no longer be written on the tracks or in the skies of Belgium. It would come with fire, steel, and precision. He would come from above, and it would fall right into the industrial heart of Germany. In March 1945, the skies of Germany were silent, not for peace but for absence. The Luftwaffe, once proud, was now a specter, and the sound that broke this silence, day after day, did not come from Messerschmitt's information. It came from the mechanical thunder of American radial engines, descending from the skies as an inevitable warning. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once the butt of jokes at German briefings, had become the sonic signature of the collapse. What once provoked derision now caused chills. Many soldiers on the Western Front reported hearing the metallic roar of the propellers before seeing any shadow on the ground. And they no longer ran to defend themselves. They ran by instinct, by panic, by survival. The thunder of fate, as some called it in whispers, was not an official nickname, but a collective confession. Among the few German pilots who survived to count, the tone was no longer one of arrogance. It was one of bitter reflection. In interrogations, short and sincere phrases began to appear in the reports. It was inevitable. We couldn't stop them. They flew as if there was never a shortage of fuel. But one testimony in particular stands out, not for its emotion, but for its coldness. Adolf Galland, a Luftwaffe fighter general, a veteran of the Battle of Britain, and one of Nazi Germany's most respected air strategists, summed it up years later. They built a bomber and called it a fighter. Laughed. They were right. That was what the war demanded. It was not a compliment. It was acceptance. Total war did not reward elegance or acrobatics. It rewards the machine that flies, resists, shoots, and comes back. And in this criterion, the P-47 was king. This change in perception was not sudden. It was carved in the skies of Falaise, in the destroyed columns in Mortagne, in the razed railways of the Ruhr. With each successful mission, with each squadron that returned unharmed, with each day when the skies saw no German response, the Thunderbolt ceased to be just an airplane. It became a symbol, from the industry that doesn't stop, of the doctrine that learns, of the war won even before the shots. And the psychological impact was profound. Infantry troops who had previously seen planes as support now treated them as leadership. It was common to see American soldiers saying, "If we hear the noise of the Thunderbolts, we are safe." The Germans, on the other hand, knew, if they listened to them, it was too late. The most impressive thing is that Thunderbolt was not born to be loved. It wasn't sleek like the Spitfire. It wasn't cinematic like the Mustang. He was a brute, a winged tank. But in this clumsy body dwelt the logic of victory. Armored, armed, fast in diving, resistant as naval steel. Everything about it was oversized. Not by mistake, by intention. It was a weapon designed to survive the impossible and repeat the attack. And that's what he did, day after day, thousands of times, without fail, without giving in, without hesitation. The very structure of the plane told its story. The armor around the pilot, the self-sealing tanks, the supercharger adapted for extreme altitudes, the 850 barrels arranged to create a corridor of fire. Every detail was redundancy. Each bolt was a vote in the certainty that resisting was more important than maneuvering. And in the end, that won. The late recognition of the Germans does not rewrite the beginning of history, but it gives it greater weight. Because the respect of the enemy is the hardest medal to earn. And the P-47 conquered, not out of charm, but out of constancy. Not for aesthetic genius, but for applied brutality. The war had changed. The era of individual aces was dying. The era of squadrons supported by logistics, missions sustained by unlimited fuel, serial-trained pilots, factories that win battles before soldiers are mobilized was born. And in this new world, Thunderbolt was the pioneer. The forerunner of a doctrine that depended not on glory, but on production. Not of isolated talent, but of national planning. In 1945, the war was in its final throes, but the roar of the P-47 continued, now about cities like Leipzig, Dresden, Nuremberg. Their targets were no longer just tanks and locomotives. They were symbols of an ideology that had staked everything on speed, individual heroism, military aesthetics, and lost. Because in the end, victory came from the most unlikely place, the stuffy factories of the American countryside, of the night work of workers with calloused hands, from steel cast in Detroit, cast in Farmingdale, tested in the fields of Kansas. The initial laugh from the German drivers was not just an error of judgment, it was the harbinger of his ruin. And there was more, because the last statistic had not yet been revealed. The cruelest, the one that would end the doubt, the one that would officially transform the P-47 into the most lethal fighter of the entire Second World War. This truth would come not from the heavens, but from the records, and would prove irrefutably that the thunder was not just sound. It was a sentence. Today, more than 80 years after its first flight, the P-47 Thunderbolt still rests in quiet hangars, displayed in aviation museums as an artifact of steel and purpose. But it is not standing still. It is loaded with history. Every rivet on its fuselage carries the weight of a doctrine that forever changed the way war would be fought. Not only by force, but by logic applied to destruction. The Thunderbolt wasn't just a fighter, it was a platform for military thinking. He redefined what it meant to dominate the sky. Speed was not enough, endurance was needed. Elegance was not enough, calibrated aggressiveness was needed. It wasn't enough to pilot well. You had to fly back even with the flaps destroyed, the rudder mutilated and holes the size of fists running through the cockpit. It had to be made to last. And he was. The technical legacy of the P-47 spanned the post-war period. Its lessons shaped future aircraft like the A-10 Thunderbolt II, named not coincidentally. A plane made with the same principle of functional brutality. Survive hell, deliver precise destruction, protect what is on the ground. In the 21st century, U.S. Air Force pilots are still studying boom and zoom tactics applied at new speeds and contexts. The doctrines of escort, cover, and attack in depth were all improved from what the Thunderbolt did between 1943 and 1945. It has become a technical reference, a milestone of engineering applied to the battlefield, where performance is measured not in maneuvers, but in mission accomplished. Respect for this machine has crossed borders and ideologies. Many German pilots, upon surrendering, asked to see a P-47 up close, not with hatred, out of curiosity, with restrained admiration, with that bitter acceptance of those who understand that the war was not only lost on the battlefield, but on the drawing boards and in the warehouses of American factories. And on the Allied side, the feeling was almost spiritual. For veterans who flew the Thunderbolt, it wasn't just a machine. It was a shield. It was a fist. It was the certainty that even when everything went wrong, that steel bubble could still bring them home. Reports from surviving pilots are almost always unanimous. He was the one who saved me. Not the training, not luck, the plane. In ceremonies in the United States and Europe, replicas of the P-47 still cross the skies on commemorative dates. The deep roar of the radial engine is greeted with respectful silence by those watching from the ground. It's not a show, it is a tribute. A reminder that victory in that war did not come only from the decisions of generals but from the persistence of engineers. That technology is not cold. It has a soul when used with purpose. And the purpose of the P-47 was simple: to fly, to fight, to survive, and repeat. A machine programmed to protect Allied lives and destroy targets with almost mathematical efficiency. So even decades later, alongside monuments in Illinois, Indiana, Utah, and Normandy, veterans who today can barely stand up without help still cry at the sight of the familiar silhouette of the Jug streaking across the sky, because that sound connects them to the impossible they have experienced, to the improbable that they survived. At a museum in France, a local guide sums up in one sentence what the P-47 represented to European civilians. When we heard that sound, we knew the Germans were going to leave. There is no more precise description. Thunderbolt was not just an instrument of war, it was an omen of liberation. His roar announced that the empire of fear was crumbling, and that the roads of freedom would be opened by metal wings and 8 machine guns spitting justice. By the end of the conflict, more than 15,000 Thunderbolts had been produced. More than 500,000 missions were executed, thousands of tanks destroyed, tracks erased, planes shot down. But his most powerful contribution was perhaps invisible. He shattered the myth of absolute German superiority. It showed that modern warfare is won by those who think of scale, not glory, by those who understand that machines should be built to repeat, not to impress. And in this field, no rival came close. But history still holds its final moment, because all these achievements, all these numbers and tributes still don't say everything. One last statistic is missing. One last piece of data that will transform the legacy of the P-47 not only into a symbol of World War II, but into the absolute champion of the skies of that conflict. The fact that the Germans never imagined, and that would end, once and for all, any trail of doubt about who really dominated the air, and it will be revealed now. What began with laughter ended in silence. By 1945, the skies of Europe no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. What was left of its former glory flew on suicide missions, trying to postpone the inevitable. Their aces were dead, their hangars in ruins, their fuel tanks empty. The P-47 Thunderbolt, born of raw steel and American industrial faith, didn't just survive the mockery, it buried it under rubble and twisted tracks. With more than 15,000 units produced, thousands of columns destroyed, and a return rate that defied the physics of war, the Jug established itself as the most lethal fighter bomber of World War II. He didn't win because he was elegant. It won because it was designed to last, and because behind each takeoff there was an entire country awake, producing, replenishing, reimagining. Germany lost in the air because it lost on the assembly line. The doctrine of individual talent has succumbed to collective talent, and it is here that military history reveals its most bitter and enduring lesson. In the age of total war, tactics flies, but it is logistics that sustain. Isolated genius does not resist organized volume. Silent engineering is worth 1,000 temporary victories. Thunderbolt proved that true air power isn't just in what you see in the skies, it's in what you make on the ground. He was too big, too heavy, too strange, and that's precisely why he won. The absurd became a virtue, the improbable doctrine, and whoever laughed first fell without understanding how. General Adolf Galland, in reflecting on the collapse of the Luftwaffe, did not choose euphemisms. He said with German coolness, "We were defeated by trucks. They had more, always more. And among these trucks were those carrying airframes, ammunition, R-2800 radial engines, and 4-meter propellers. They carried the components of the thunder that would tear through the sky of Europe until there was nothing left." If you value deep research, based on real facts and documents, please leave your like and subscribe now. This helps us keep revealing the details that history books often forget. Write in the comments, what was the most unbelievable data for you? Activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating account of military reality. And don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.